Understanding God's plan. We're on lesson 8. And we're going to start with Exodus 4th chapter tonight. We have gone through the Moses at the burning bush, seeing God there, God speaking to him out of the burning bush, and him being a little bit hesitant about accepting the call that God had called him to. Isn't that something? If God calls you to something, He knows you can handle it. I mean, He's God, so He would know that, but Moses couldn't figure it out. But anyway, we're going to go Exodus 4th chapter, starting with the 21st verse. The Lord instructed Moses, when you go back to Egypt, make sure you do all the wonders before Pharaoh that I have put within your power. But I will harden his heart so that he won't let the people go. Then you will say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says. Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn son. That's pretty serious stuff. First thing I want to talk about is this expression here. It says, God says He would harden. Let me get back up here. It says, I will harden his heart. And so the question comes in, and I've heard this discussed by many different people, read a lot of different articles and so on, about whether this hardening his heart, was it permissive or was it causative? Was God hardening his heart, or was He allowing his heart to be hardened? And people have discussed it back and forth. I don't know if this is as important as what some people think it is, but going the wrong way. Hebrews 3:8 says, do not harden your heart as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. What had Pharaoh told the midwives to do with the Hebrew babies? To kill the firstborn. That didn't work out. What did He tell them to next? He told them to throw them in the river. Throw them in the Nile. Okay. Does this sound like a soft-hearted person? This is before Moses ever showed up to deliver them. He was already having babies killed. He's having male babies killed. That doesn't sound like a soft-hearted person. That sounded like to me, you didn't have to work very hard to get this fellow hard-hearted. He was kind of already headed that way. So when you run into, the only reason I brought this up is because, like I said, people have written articles and upon articles upon articles about what this means. And I think a lot of times we pay too much attention to what's not that important. Whether hardening of Pharaoh's heart was causative or permissive is irrelevant as to his treatment of the children of Israel. And we saw that by what we were just talking about. So anyway, I went going back to Exodus 2nd chapter, 23rd verse. It says, after a long time the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help ascended to God because of the difficult labor. So God heard their groaning, and He remembered their covenant with Abraham. You notice that? He remembered their covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites and took notice. So, the questions. Were the Israelites the only people in the world that were suffering at this time, do you think? Do you think there was suffering in the world besides just what they were suffering? You look at the things around the world today, there's people suffering all over the world. In fact, we have it good compared to 90% of the rest of the world. Why didn't God deliver them all? Why did He just deliver the Israelites? They were His chosen people. Why were they His chosen people? Pardon me? Because of the covenant. He mentioned back there, he said because of the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, He had a covenant with these people, a covenant relationship. This people had to be preserved in order for the Messiah to come into the world. So, as we talked about weeks and weeks in the past about the birthright, passing the birthright from generation to generation to generation, and how now the birthright is kept preserved within a nation of peoples. And like, we don't know how many there was, but if you figure it up, there's probably 2 or 3 million of the people of the Israelites that were in Egypt at this time. That's a lot of folks. So it was the people that the birthright was being passed down through, so this people had to be preserved. So, Exodus 4, verse 5. This will take place, he continued, so they will believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Everything, you notice, everything he says, and I know sometimes you begin to think in this particular course especially that I talk a lot about the Abrahamic covenant, but the reason I do is because the Bible does. A lot of times we skip over it because we're looking at different things and paying attention to other parts of it, but you see how many times it's already been mentioned here. And I put it down, Abraham is referenced over 70 times in the New Testament. That's in the New Testament, over 70 times in the New Testament. So would you say he's important to God's plan? I would think so too. 4:5, read that again. This will take place, he continued, so they will believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to them. He says, this will take place. He didn't say this might take place. He says, this will take place. Now, what's this in reference to? What is he talking about? And we'll get a list of things here to look at. Moses asked God, remember he said, well, if I go to tell the children of Israel that I'm going to set them free and that you've sent me, who shall I say sent me? What's your name? And he told them what his name was. He said, I am that I am. He says, well, how can I prove that I'm doing what you've told me to do? What's the evidence that I have? So God gave him some things. He showed him, he said, he told him, he said, throw down your staff. And he threw down his staff and it turned into a snake. If you threw your staff down and it turned into a snake, what would you do? Well, then look at the next thing. He told him to take him by the tail and pick him up. How many of you would have done that? Well, when he threw him down, threw the staff down, it turned into a snake. And then he grabbed him by the tail, it turned back into a staff. And then what followed that, he stuck his hand into his robe and he pulled it back. And I've got a note there. A lot of skin diseases in the Bible they refer to as leprosy, so we're not really sure which one they're talking about. But he stuck his hand in. When he brought it out, it was leprous. It said it was white. It was leprous. That would have kind of gotten my attention too. And he says, stick it back in. He put it back in and took it back out. And it was clear. It was completely clear. There's another sign. And then he said, well, what? Still, if you go back and read, didn't want to read all of what it said there. If you go back and read what Moses said, what if he still won't listen to me? What if he said, well, he said, take some water out of the Nile and pour it on the ground and it'll turn to blood. So that convinced Moses, right? Who do you think these signs were really for? I'm about to tear up something here. Was this sign for Moses? Was this sign to prove something to Moses, to the children of Israel, to Pharaoh? It's probably all of them, isn't it? It's to help. Even with all that evidence to Moses, he still didn't want to go. He still didn't think he could handle it. And he continued to make excuses about why he couldn't go. Made one excuse after another, but God kept saying, hey, well, we can do it this way. And you do all these signs. You go, if he won't believe it, you do this. Throw your staff down and turn into a snake. If somebody comes to me and they say, I want you to do this, I say, I'm not going to do it. And they say, well, watch this. And they throw their stick down and it turns into a snake. I said, okay, I'll do it. We're done. We don't have to talk anymore. Exodus 4:21. The Lord instructed Moses, when you go back to Egypt, make sure you do all the wonders before Pharaoh that I have put within your power. Make sure you do them all. but I will harden his heart so that he won't let the people go. Then you will say to Pharaoh, this is what Yahweh says, Israel is my firstborn son. Did you ever notice that before? And that it said, Israel is my firstborn son. Who's Israel? Was Jacob? Was he the firstborn son of Isaac? No, he was the secondborn son. It says, Israel, my firstborn son. God doesn't tally things up the way we do. He doesn't do the things the way we do. He says, Israel is my firstborn son. I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn. 420 in verse 24. On the trip, now pay attention to this. On the trip, at an overnight campsite, it happened that the Lord confronted him and sought to put him to death. He's talking to Moses. He's trying to kill him. He said, I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. And on the way, while they were camping, it says God decided he wanted to kill Moses. Now this makes sense, does it? He says, so Zipporah, that's Moses' wife, took a flint, cut off her son's foreskin, and threw it at Moses' feet. Then she said, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. At that time, she said, you are a bridegroom of blood, referring to the circumcision. Okay, first place, let's back up a little bit. How old is Moses at this time? 80. So he's 80 years old. If you want to know, 83 is what Aaron was at this time. But 80 is what Moses was. How long had he been in Midian? 40 years. So how old was his son? It doesn't tell us, but my point is he could have been anywhere from his 30s, his 20s, and so on. And it says Zipporah took a flint and circumcised him. Why was this important? Why did this mean anything at all? Why did they do this? Why did God stop him there and make this happen before he could go any further? I said, why was it important for Moses to do? Why did it matter? What was one of the covenant things with the children of Israel? The rite of circumcision was the last thing that was required of Abraham in order for him to be the covenant people with God, for him to be the covenant man with God. And evidently Moses had not been following that when he was in Midian. Here he was, the man, the Jew, that was chosen to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, and yet he wasn't walking according to the covenant himself. So God corrected that before he got there. And it appears here that he was not following the Abrahamic covenant at the time, so this needed to be taken care of. God couldn't bring somebody that was supposed to be in the covenant relationship to free the people who were in a covenant relationship if he was not fully in the covenant relationship. Does that make sense? Okay. I hope so. Without the covenant, there would be no Messiah. Why? You don't have to answer that yet, but just think about it. Without the covenant, the Messiah would never come. Without this covenant relationship that Moses had to be in, the Messiah would never come into this world. Verse 29, then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. Aaron repeated everything that, remember, Moses had to tell Aaron, and Aaron had to speak for him because that's what it says. Aaron repeated everything the Lord had said to Moses and performed the signs before the people. The people believed. It says the people believed. Okay? They believed. Keep that in mind. And when they heard that the Lord had paid attention to them and that he had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. So this sounds like a thankful group of people, right? And they're glad that God set them free. They believed what he said. They believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exodus 5:1. Later Moses and Aaron went in and said to Pharaoh, "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness." He tells them, says, "Let my people go." And what did Pharaoh say? He said, "Okay, that's no problem," right? No. But Pharaoh responded, "Who is Yahweh?" How many gods did Pharaoh worship? From what we know, there's a bunch of them. He had never heard of Yahweh. When you think about this a minute now, the chosen people of God had been living in this land for 400 years. Joseph, remember, was second to Pharaoh. So he didn't know him by the name of Yahweh, but that Pharaoh had heard about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of Joseph. But this is 400 years later. So who is Yahweh that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I did not know anything about Yahweh, and besides, I will not let Israel go. Period. I'm not letting them go. Verse 19. The Israelite foremen saw that they were in trouble when they were told, "You cannot reduce your daily quota of bricks." What had happened here? Because there's something happened before this. They were furnishing the straw for them to make bricks out of, and they had a certain quantity of bricks, a quota of bricks that they were supposed to make. With them furnishing the straw, then they came back and said, "We're not going to furnish you any straw." Instead of Pharaoh making it easier, he made it worse. He said, "I'm not going to furnish you any straw. You have to gather your own straw. You have to make just as many bricks." When they left Pharaoh, they confronted Moses. Now listen to this. This is the people that, what did it say? It says they believed and they worshiped. When they left, so here's the way we humans are. When things are going good, we have no problem worshiping God. Then we get in a tight. When they left Pharaoh, they confronted Moses and Aaron, who stood waiting to meet them. "May the Lord take note of you and judge," they said to them, "because you have made us reek in front of Pharaoh and his officials, putting a sword in their hand to kill us." Does this sound like a grateful bunch of people who believed in God and believed that God was going to deliver them? They wanted it all to be easy. They wanted it all to be simple. What is this? If something is... What's the problem with giving something to people so many times? They don't appreciate it. When people get something for nothing, they don't appreciate it. It's one of the problems to me with the government giving money to citizens is the citizens are not thankful to anybody for what they got. I'm not talking about Social Security and stuff that you paid into. I'm talking about different type of welfare programs and so on. People are not thankful for the government. They say, "We're so thankful the government's giving us money. We just appreciate it." And they come by and shake your hand and say, "Look, I'm glad. Thank you for paying your tax dollars because I'm getting free money from the government for it, and I know that you pay." But they're not thankful. But if I see somebody in need and I take them some money, more often than not, they're thankful. It did them good and it did me good. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. "Because you have made us reek in front of Pharaoh and his officials, putting a sword in their hand to kill us." They wanted it to be easy. Verse 22. "So Moses went back to the Lord and asked, 'Lord, why have you caused trouble for this people? And why did you ever send me?'" Here he goes again. "Why did you ever send me? I told you I wasn't the one. Ever since I went into Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has caused trouble for this people, and you haven't delivered your people at all." Would you talk like that to God? Would you speak like that to God? Now, let me tell you what that tells me. It tells me that God chose the right person. He chose the right man, because Moses, he's standing up to God. He's questioning. He's saying, "You haven't delivered your people at all." That's an accusation. I wouldn't accuse God of something like that. But it was true, wasn't it? That you haven't delivered these people. He was a lot closer to God than what it was seen. He said, and you haven't delivered your people at all. I said, can you begin to see why Moses was the right one for the job? He was the right choice after all. God knew what he was doing. Who would ever guess that? That God knew what he was doing. 6:2. Then God spoke to Moses, telling him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as Almighty God, but I did not reveal my name Yahweh to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land they lived in as foreigners. So he's telling them, they didn't know me by this name. This is a name that I have given you for the children of Israel at this particular time, but they knew me as God, and we had a covenant relationship, but they didn't know me as that. But you notice he tied them back again. What does he do? He goes right back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He goes back every time and ties it in because that's important. 7th verse. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am Yahweh, your God, who delivered you from the forced labor of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There he goes again. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give it to you as a possession. I am Yahweh. I will give this land that I promised to them, that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He made a promise to Abraham 400 and some years earlier, and he's keeping his word 400 and some years later. So, why did it take so many plagues before Pharaoh released them? How many plagues did it take? 10. You close. It was 10. There were 10 plagues. Why didn't God just pick them up and set them in the promised land? Well, they wouldn't appreciate it, but there's another reason too. Hang on to that one. Why was it even necessary for them to go to the land of Canaan? Why was it important that they go to the land of Canaan? And I put down there, couldn't God have just taken Egypt and taken it away from the Egyptians and given it to them? Okay, here you go. Here's your land. You can stay right here. You don't even have to move. You can stay right here.
Well, it was in the covenant that's what it was going to do, and it was a place that they could be prosperous and bountiful and replenished.
What you're saying, it was part of the covenant. This was included in the covenant. If it's included in the covenant, then that land is part of the covenant relationship. That was the land that the covenant was tied to. That's the reason they had to go back to that land. Why didn't he just pick them up and move them? It's because man is the one that salvation had to come through. God, if he just did it, then he would be going against his word, because remember, way back in the beginning, he gave the earth, all of the world, to man. He says, this is yours. You have dominion. You take authority. You subdue it. This is yours. This earth belongs to you. He gave it to man. If he'd have done that, then he'd have come here and he'd been taking the earth back himself. And God does not take stuff back that he gives. So, and part of this, and the reason this is important, is because part of this answers the question as to why Jesus needed to come into the world in the first place, which we'll get to soon. And I've kind of repeated this question: who was God trying to convince in all of this? Was he trying to convince Pharaoh or Moses or the Israelites? It took 10 plagues. 10 plagues. And you see what I've got there. And then the second one, did God have the authority on this earth to move them supernaturally? And the answer is no. God didn't have the authority on that. Who had the authority? Man did. He had to do it through man. It had to be through man. But God, It would be a lot easier on God if he just didn't have to do that, because we human beings are bad to work with. We've never been good to work with. Always been a problem. You read all through the Bible, read all through history. We've always been a problem. Verse 10. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go from this land." But Moses said in the Lord's presence, "If the Israelites will not listen to me, then how will Pharaoh listen to me, since I am such a poor speaker?" Here he goes again. He's going back to this same old line that he started with when he was at the burning bush. I'm such a poor speaker. There's no way in the world I can convince any. If I can't even convince the children of Israel, how am I going to convince Pharaoh? This is the same man that just was challenged God and said, "You hadn't delivered your people at all." This was the same man. Does he sound like us? He can be in faith and then he can be in doubt. Verse 28. On the day the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, he said to him, "I am Yahweh. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, everything I am telling you." But Moses replied in the Lord's presence. This again, here we go. Says, "I am such a poor speaker. How will Pharaoh listen to me?" He can't get off of that kick. Chapter 7, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go." Down in verse 17. This is what Yahweh says. "Here is how you will know that I am Yahweh." So here's how you will know. "Watch, I will strike the water in the Nile with the staff in my hand, and it will turn to blood. The fish in the Nile will die. The river will stink, and the Egyptians will be unable to drink water from it." Doesn't that sound wonderful? So what are the plagues? There are 10 plagues. This is the 10 plagues in order. They had blood. The river was turned to blood, and they couldn't get water. That's where their drinking water came from. That's what they bathed in. That's what they watered their crops in, and that water turned to blood. Well, I would have been, if I'd have had any say at all, I'd have said, "Pharaoh, could you do me a favor? Let these people go. Well, we want to get rid of them." And then it had frogs. Now imagine, how many of you watched the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston? You remember the scene where it had all the frogs in there? I don't know where they got all those frogs. But can you imagine you had frogs in your bed and all over your floor and in your kitchen and everywhere had frogs. And then you had lice and gnats. Pardon me? Rather had the frogs. Then it had flies on top of that. Then their livestock died. The Egyptians' livestock died, but the Israelites' livestock didn't die. You think...
Was the water blood all this time, or did it go back to water so they could drink?
It changed back. I'm quite sure. If I'm wrong, I'll let you know. But they got to where they could drink. But their livestock died. Then they had boils. They started breaking out in boils because they wouldn't let them go. Was Pharaoh hard-hearted or what? Hard-hearted and hard-headed. I mean, he was a pain. Then hail. Had hail that was so big it killed people. Had locusts that came in and ate up everything. Then there was darkness. It was pitch black. That would be one of the worst things to me in living in Alaska. During the winter when it's dark all the time. That'd get on my nerves. And then you had the death of the firstborn. It took all 10 of these before Pharaoh was willing to let this people go as God had told them to do. Yes?
Do we know though what span of time?
Have no idea.
So, I mean, when the water turned to blood and that created all of the things that developed from the bad water,
Mm-hmm.
and the boil and everything else. And I mean, but we don't know. I mean, that could have been what we would consider a short period of time.
We don't know. Didn't tell us. As far as I can tell, it doesn't tell us what kind of time frame it was, how long it took from the first plague to the last plague. All I know is there's 10 of them. And he wouldn't pay attention, and he would kind of relent, and then he'd turn back, and he'd kind of relent. And if you remember, that even after he finally told them, you can go, and they were all out, then he changed his mind and sent his army to go get them. So he was still kind of hard-headed and hard-hearted. Some people say, so I'll bring this up, some people say that the 10 plagues have to do, each one of the plagues have to do with a god that was worshipped in Egypt at this time. I don't know how anybody would know that, because the Bible doesn't tell us that. Did they worship a lot of gods? Yes. And could these have had something to do with it? Could have. And it could have been that God said, okay, you worship the god of flies, you're going to get flies. You worship the god of frog, you're going to get a bunch of frogs. You worship, so in other words, it could have been each one. I have no idea, but that's not important enough for it to be in the Bible, or it would be. Exodus 5:2, but Pharaoh responded, "Who is Yahweh that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I do not know anything about Yahweh, and besides, I will not let Israel go." Do you think by the end of this 10th plague, he was beginning to get some idea of who Yahweh was? He said, before the plague started, he said, I don't know any Yahweh. Why should I listen to what he has to say? I don't have anything to do with Yahweh. Never heard of him. I've got plenty of gods of my own. Now, I'm making all this up. He could have said, I got plenty of gods of my own. I worship all these gods. Why do I need to worship Yahweh? He's your God. There are a number of things he could have said involving that, but at this time, do you think it's beginning to dawn on him that there's something going on that's supernatural? If not, he was a dummy. Is all I can tell you. Exodus 12:1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month is to be the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of your year." Now it says the first month of the year, but it's the first month of their religious year, first month of their civil year, which you'll find out later on in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. The first month of the civil year was Rosh Hashanah, which was months earlier. But this is Passover. It is the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day, on the 10th day of this month, they must each select an animal of the flock according to their father's household. 6th verse. You are to keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. Why were they to select the lamb on the 10th, the animal on the 10th, and wait until the 14th to slaughter the animal? They were supposed to examine the animal in that period of time. From that 10th day to that 14th day, they were to examine that animal and make sure that that animal was pure, because it's the only one that you could sacrifice for this. They must take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses where they eat them. 11th verse. Here's how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel. Your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in a hurry. It's the Lord's Passover. Why? Why did they have to eat it in a hurry? You have these people that, to begin with, when Moses came to them and showed them the signs and everything, they believed God and they worshiped God and all that. And then when things didn't work out quite like they wanted to, say, "What have you done to us, Moses? It's gotten worse. It hadn't gotten better. You said things are going to get better, that we're going to be delivered. Instead of getting delivered, things are getting worse for us." And now here they are. They're prepared. The reason they're eating with their prepared for travel is because their deliverance is going to be immediate. It's going to be in a hurry. And these people had somehow they'd grown enough faith in the meantime where they would listen to God. Because they had to do something. They had to sacrifice this. They had to pick it out on the 10th day. Then they had to sacrifice it. Then they had to eat it. And they had to eat it with their shoes on and their clothes on, ready to go, and their bags packed, because God's going to deliver them. And it's instant. It's immediate. They had to be prepared. Plagues seem to have been not only convince Pharaoh, but also the children of Israel. It says in the 11th verse, here's how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover. You are to eat it in a hurry. Throughout Genesis and Exodus, the thread that leads to the Messiah is seen through what we see here. This thread that we're looking at is all pointing to who Jesus is. The importance of the covenant with Abraham cannot be stressed too much, because it was this covenant that brings all this. The children of Israel wouldn't be being delivered if it hadn't been for the covenant that was made with Abraham. This one man believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. It is that covenant that preserved and delivered the children of Israel, and it's that covenant that led to the Messiah coming to this earth. Any questions?